January 1944. The Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. Outside, the forest sat under hard winter snow, swallowing sound. Inside the headquarters complex, the air was stale with cigarette smoke, damp wool, and the ink smell of fresh situation reports. Maps were already crowded. Front lines in the east, shipping tallies from the Atlantic, and now a third layer that kept thickening. The air war over the Reich. The daily summaries arrived in neat stacks. Sortie counts, loss columns, aircraft types, target names that repeated until they stopped meaning anything. Ball bearing works, aircraft plants, rail yards, refinery sites. The numbers were never static. They rose, raid after raid, month after month. German defenses were not absent. They were firing, scrambling, climbing. The flak belts still threw steel into the sky. Fighter groups still intercepted. And yet the pattern that mattered most was simple. The American formations kept coming back, often bigger than before, as if punishment itself failed to slow the engine that produced them. To understand what Hitler was noticing in those tables, you have to understand how the daylight air war reached this point. By the time those Wolf's Lair reports began to thicken with air war statistics, the foundations had been laid 2 years earlier, quietly, methodically, and at enormous industrial cost. In 1942, the United States arrived in Britain not as a finished striking force, but as a promise under construction. The U.S. 8th Air Force began building its bases across eastern England. Runways poured into farmland, dispersal pens cut into hedgerows, fuel dumps and bomb stores stacked into the countryside. The idea behind it was deliberate and rigid, daylight precision bombing. Heavy bombers, most famously the B-17 Flying Fortress and later increasing numbers of B-24 Liberators, would fly in tight formations, defend themselves with overlapping machine gun fire, and hit specific industrial targets in occupied Europe and Germany. That concept did not exist in isolation. Britain had already been bombing for years, but by 1941 to 1942, RAF Bomber Command had shifted heavily toward night area bombing, partly because daylight operations had proven too costly without overwhelming fighter cover. The emerging Allied bargain became clearer as 1942 turned into 1943. British bombers would strike by night. American bombers would strike by day. The aim was not simply destruction, but pressure, round-the-clock disruption that would force Germany to defend everywhere continuously. Germany's defenses were not passive targets waiting to be tested. By this stage of the war, the Reich had assembled one of the densest air defense networks in the world. Radar stations feeding information to fighter control systems, belts of heavy anti-aircraft artillery, flak, around major cities and industrial zones, and a fighter force, the Luftwaffe's day fighters, built around aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190. The system was designed to break raids through interception and attrition. Push bombers off course, shatter formations, then finish the damaged stragglers on the way home. The first American raids over France in 1942 were relatively limited in scale, and they carried the feel of experimentation. New crews, new navigation problems, new timing issues, and the constant question of what happened once formations crossed the channel and moved beyond immediate help. In 1943, the tempo increased. The 8th Air Force began pushing deeper into occupied Europe with attacks on submarine construction and port facilities, aircraft factories, and transportation nodes. Each mission forced the same arithmetic: how many bombers could be sent, how many would return, how fast replacements could be trained, and whether the system could keep expanding faster than it bled. But the central weakness was already visible to both sides. Escort fighters, critical to protecting bombers from concentrated fighter attacks, had limited range in the early phase of the campaign. They could guard formations for part of the route, then turn back as fuel ran short, leaving heavy bombers to continue alone into the most dangerous airspace. German commanders watched those turning points as carefully as they watched bomb bay doors. So by mid-1943, two machines were accelerating toward each other: an American bombing force growing in scale and confidence, and a German defense system that believed it could still impose a price high enough to make the effort unsustainable, until the targets moved farther and the raids began to probe beyond the last safe mile of fighter cover. The air war's most decisive lessons were not learned in theory rooms. They were learned in the space between contrails, where a formation held together, where it broke, and where a single aircraft became a lone target against an entire defense network. In 1943, the American Daylight Campaign began reaching for Germany's inner industrial spine. Targets like Regensburg and Schweinfurt were not chosen for symbolism. They were chosen for function. Regensburg's aircraft production mattered. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing industry was woven through German manufacturing like a hidden ligament. In August and October 1943, the 8th Air Force struck these kinds of deep targets and paid for it. The missions proved two things at once: that American bombers could reach far into Germany, and that without continuous escort protection, they could be cut down at a rate that threatened the entire strategy. Those loss figures were not abstract. They were aircraft destroyed, crews killed or captured, squadrons hollowed out. They were also time, months of training erased, in minutes of concentrated interception. German defenses, when properly concentrated and guided, could still turn the sky into a killing space. The Luftwaffe's day fighters, directed by radar and ground control, could form into attack waves. Flak belts could force formations to tighten, climb, or break at the worst moments. For a time, the German system seemed to have found its proof. If the Americans insisted on daylight precision without full escort, Germany could make the cost unbearable. But the United States had built its strategy around industrial endurance. The American answer to loss was not only courage or doctrine, it was production, training pipelines, and adaptation at scale. By late 1943 and into early 1944, the critical change arrived in the form of range. The escort problem began to be solved. Longer-range fighters, most famously the P-51 Mustang, and improved range variants of the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning began to extend protective cover deeper into Germany. Drop tanks, revised escort tactics, and better command coordination meant the bombers were no longer alone at the point where German fighters had once been able to concentrate with near impunity. At the same time, the Allies shifted toward a more integrated understanding of what the air war needed to achieve. It was not enough to damage factories and hope the German system simply collapsed. The air campaign increasingly focused on degrading the Luftwaffe itself, its aircraft production, repair facilities, airfields, and most importantly, its trained pilots. The bombing campaign began to treat German air power as a system with inputs and outputs, not as a single opponent that could be defeated by one perfect strike. This thinking shaped what came next: the concentrated assault known as Big Week in February 1944. A sustained series of heavy attacks aimed primarily at German aircraft production and the fighter force that defended it. The plan was brutally logical: force the Luftwaffe to rise repeatedly, force it to fight, force it to lose aircraft, and, more critically, experienced pilots at a rate it could not replace. The bombers would hit the factories, the escorts would hunt the interceptors. The German defense system would be dragged into repeated engagements until attrition became irreversible. So when Hitler looked at the tables in early 1944, what he was seeing was not a single failure on a single day. He was noticing a shift in the underlying balance. German defenses still existed, still fired, still inflicted losses, but the American machine was now structured to grow through punishment, not be slowed by it. That is the point where the angles become clear, because the failure was not only tactical, it was structural, human, and technological at the same time. Hitler did not need to stand on an airfield to understand the air war's direction. He lived inside a world of reports, production tables, loss returns, and promises from subordinates that the next measure would finally solve the problem. In the early years, that rhythm had often worked for him. A crisis arrived, orders intensified, resources shifted, the front stabilized, or a new weapon appeared, or an enemy paused. The air war did not behave that way. What Hitler noticed was not just that American bombers were striking Germany, it was that German defenses were being forced into a continuous posture, always reacting, always consuming resources, always meeting a force that could be regenerated faster than it could be destroyed. The Luftwaffe could still score, flak could still kill. Fighter Gruppen could still break formations. Yet after each day's arithmetic, the larger pattern remained. The Americans were scaling up. This created a kind of leadership trap. Hitler's instinct was to impose will, demand more aircraft, demand stronger defenses, demand miracle responses. But air defense was a system that depended on training time, fuel availability, maintenance cycles, radar coverage, and intact airfields. None of those could be commanded into existence overnight. As the pressure rose, Hitler leaned harder on directives. Yet the ceiling was not made of intention. It was made of logistics and physics. And when the ceiling is physics, the leader's will becomes a noise inside a machine that does not care. Germany's homeland defense had been designed around a recognizable problem: raids that could be predicted, tracked, and met with a concentrated response. The system's strength was coordination. Radar stations detected formations. Controllers vectoring fighters could mass interceptors at chosen points. Flak belts forced bombers into higher altitudes and tighter formations, increasing bombing error and creating opportunities for fighter attack. That model functioned best when the enemy's tempo left space to reset. Crews needed recovery time. Aircraft needed repair. Ammunition had to be moved back into gun positions. Fighter units needed maintenance windows and rest to keep pilots sharp. The American approach threatened that logic by aiming for continuity. Day after day, the 8th Air Force pushed larger formations, and the defense system, no matter how sophisticated, was forced to spend itself repeatedly. A defense can be excellent and still be exhausted. When the attacker controls the rhythm, the defender's skill becomes less decisive than the defender's ability to endure. So the core problem was not that German defenses were incompetent. It was that they were being asked to do something that homeland defense systems rarely survive: to fight an industrial opponent at industrial tempo without a reliable pause, while the battlefield in the air expanded to include their own airfields, their own training system, and eventually their own fuel lifelines. That is where the technological angle becomes unavoidable, because once escort fighters stayed with the bombers, the very geometry of the air war changed. For much of 1943, German fighter pilots understood the map in a simple way. There were places where American escorts could reach, and places where they could not. Those boundaries were as real as coastlines. Beyond them, bombers were vulnerable. Interceptors could attack with more freedom, massing repeatedly, choosing angles, and targeting stragglers without immediately being dragged into fighter-to-fighter combat. The change did not arrive as a single dramatic invention, but as a practical solution to a practical problem: escort fighters that could stay. The appearance of longer-range escort coverage through aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and extended-range variants and tactics for other fighters meant German pilots were no longer fighting bombers alone. They were fighting an integrated system: bombers holding formation while escorts guarded, counterattacked, and increasingly took the offensive against interceptors. That matters because air defense is not just about shooting down aircraft. It is about breaking the raid. When escorts prevented formations from being shattered, the bombers remained a coherent striking mass. Even damaged aircraft could sometimes stay within the protective shell long enough to escape. Even when losses were inflicted, the attacker's main body still reached the target area with enough strength to deliver tonnage. In that sense, range was not simply distance. Range was time. Range was the ability to stay in the fight longer than the defense could sustain its effort. And once escorts stayed, the air war ceased to be a sequence of isolated raids and became a rolling campaign in which German fighters were forced to rise, fight, and risk destruction every time the bomber stream appeared, because letting it pass meant accepting direct blows to the Reich. German flak was feared for a reason. In defended zones, heavy anti-aircraft guns threw dense patterns of explosions into bomber altitudes, forcing crews to fly through bursts that could rip open wings, shatter plexiglass, sever control lines, and kill men in their positions without warning. Flak was also constant. It did not tire in the same way a fighter pilot did. It could fire in weather that grounded or confused aircraft. It could defend cities, factories, and transport hubs day after day. But flak had limits that mattered more as the war progressed. It could damage and it could kill. Yet it could not chase. It could not pursue the bomber stream back across Germany. It could not exploit a broken formation the way fighters could. And it could not by itself stop a raid from reaching a target if enough aircraft pressed through. The best flak defense works like a tax. It raises the cost of entry. It punishes the attacker. It can even make certain routes or altitudes too dangerous. But when the attacker is an industrial power capable of absorbing losses and returning at scale, a tax is not a barrier. It becomes part of the operational calculation. That is why Hitler's realization was so bleak. Germany was spending enormous resources on flak belts, ammunition, and gun crews, yet the presence of that steel in the sky did not translate into control of the sky. It inflicted pain, but it did not restore initiative. And as 1944 advanced, another angle tightened the noose: fuel and pilot quality, the hidden architecture that made air defense possible at all. February 1944 did not arrive with a single decisive battle. It arrived with a schedule. Across Britain's bomber bases, the rhythm tightened into something Germany had not fully faced before: sustained, coordinated pressure aimed at the Luftwaffe's ability to exist. The raids that followed, often grouped under the Allied offensive later remembered as Big Week, were not simply about smashing buildings. They were built to force a repeated response. American heavy bombers went for aircraft plants and assembly works, targets tied to fighters, engines, airframes, and the industrial web behind them. But in the air, the real turning point was the escort layer. Fighters did not just cling to the bomber stream as passive guards. They ranged out, met interceptors earlier, and turned the approach routes into contested space. German pilots could no longer wait for the moment when bombers drifted beyond protection. Protection was there, deep, persistent, and increasingly confident. The Luftwaffe still rose. It had no choice. If it stayed down, the factories burned and the Reich's war economy bled without resistance. If it rose, it entered a fight that was becoming less about individual skill and more about attrition. Aircraft destroyed, veterans lost. Units forced into constant sorties with shrinking time to repair and regroup. And for German defense planners, the worst part was how the pressure multiplied. The bomber formations were large enough to absorb punishment and still deliver tonnage. The escort fighters were numerous enough to hunt, not merely escort. When an engagement ended, there was no clean reset, because the next day brought another formation, another interception, another demand for experienced pilots and serviceable aircraft. By late winter into early spring 1944, the effect began to show in the only places that mattered: fewer trained men in cockpits, more rushed replacements, more aircraft grounded for lack of parts, and a defense network being forced to spend itself faster than it could rebuild. The system still functioned, but it was starting to function on borrowed time, and the next phase would strike at the one resource that made every scramble possible. By spring 1944, the air war's center of gravity shifted again, away from single factories and toward the substances that made the entire defense system move. Aircraft could be built in dispersal plants and repaired in improvised workshops. Guns could be dragged into new belts. Radar could be restored after damage, but fuel, aviation gasoline, and synthetic production was a different kind of target. It was finite, process-heavy, and vulnerable to sustained disruption. When Allied planners began striking Germany's synthetic fuel plants and refineries with growing weight through 1944, the effect reached beyond smoke and rubble. It reached training schedules, readiness cycles, and the number of times a fighter unit could rise in a week without breaking itself. This was the moment Hitler's defense problem became irreversible. Even when German fighters climbed and scored, the cost was no longer only aircraft lost in combat. It was engines worn out faster than replacements arrived. It was pilots rushed from training with fewer hours. It was squadrons forced to choose between conserving fuel for emergencies or meeting the next bomber stream that appeared on radar. A defense can survive casualties. It cannot survive the steady removal of the resource that allows it to fly. Meanwhile, the American formations did what Germany feared most. They kept returning with the look of permanence. Not one spectacular day, but a pattern that filled calendars. escorts stayed with the bombers. Intercepts became battles against a combined system rather than a single stream of heavy aircraft. And as June 1944 approached, it became increasingly clear what control of the air would mean, not as theory, but as a practical condition for invasion and movement. Mir began. Germany's air defenses still existed on paper and still killed men in the sky, but they were no longer dictating terms. They were reacting, shrinking, and consuming themselves under a pressure that did not lift. That is what made the aftermath feel less like a single defeat and more like a new atmosphere settling over the Reich. Once the balance tipped, the consequences did not announce themselves with a single communiqué. They appeared in daily friction. How hard it became to move, to repair, to plan, to concentrate force without being seen and struck. As Allied air power grew more dominant through mid to late 1944, German commanders increasingly found that the battlefield below could not be separated from the battlefield above. Rail lines, bridges, marshalling yards, and road junctions became liabilities as much as assets because they were visible, predictable, and essential. Movement that once happened in daylight shifted into night, and even then it was constrained by fuel shortages, damaged networks, and the constant risk of attack. Large formations became harder to assemble without detection. Supply flows became thinner and less reliable. Repairs consumed manpower that Germany could no longer spare. Inside the war economy, the effect was equally punishing. Bomb damage was not only about what was destroyed, it was about what could not be delivered on time, what could not be transported, what sat idle for lack of parts or power. Even when factories survived, they were forced into dispersal, improvisation, and constant recovery, conditions that reduce output even without total annihilation. And this was the strategic consequence Hitler could not reverse with orders. Once the Reich had to spend so much of its strength simply to endure the air war, every other front paid the price. Guns, crews, ammunition, and aircraft pulled into homeland defense were not available elsewhere. The defense of Germany's skies became a vast consuming task, and the more it consumed, the less capable Germany became of regaining the initiative anywhere. That is the physical aftermath. The psychological aftermath, inside command rooms and among civilians, was quieter and more corrosive. For German leadership, the air war produced a specific kind of anxiety, the sense that time no longer belonged to them. Earlier in the conflict, Germany could still imagine decisive turns, new offensives, new lines, moments when the enemy's strength might stall. By late 1944, the air pressure made that imagination harder to maintain. Decisions narrowed under the constant requirement to protect what remained. Fighter units were shifted and reshuffled. Flak belts expanded around priority zones. Emergency measures multiplied. Yet each measure felt less like a solution and more like a way to survive the next week. For civilians, the experience was uneven but increasingly universal. Warning sirens, shelter routines, smoke-stained mornings, the empty spaces where familiar streets had been. These were not simply damage. They were proof that the state could no longer guarantee basic safety inside its own territory. Morale was shaped not only by fear but by repetition. A single raid can be endured as an event. A sustained campaign becomes an environment. And within the Luftwaffe itself, the human cost sharpened. Veteran pilots, men with the instincts that keep aircraft alive, were lost. And those who replaced them often arrived with less training time, fewer hours, fewer chances to learn before being thrown into combat against escort fighters that were now aggressive, numerous, and increasingly experienced. The defense still fought, but it fought with diminishing depth. This is why Hitler's notice mattered. He was seeing the moment when a defense system can still kill, and yet still fails to slow the force that is dismantling it. The final meaning of that failure is not only military, it is historical. What Hitler noticed in early 1944 was not a single tactical mistake that could be corrected with a new order. It was the collision between two kinds of war. Germany's air defenses were built around expertise and control, radar cues, interception plans, flak belts, disciplined fighter units, and a command system designed to meet threats as they appeared. Against limited raids, that kind of structure can impose fearsome costs. It can punish overreach. It can even convince an attacker that the sky is closed. But the United States was not trying to win the air war with one flawless strike. It was building an air war that functioned like an industry. Bombers could be replaced. Crews could be trained in pipelines measured in months, not years. Tactics could be revised across an entire force as lessons were learned. And when escorts began to stay with the formations, the battle stopped being about whether German defenses could hurt the attacker. The question became whether they could hurt the attacker enough, fast enough, for long enough to force the machine to slow. They could not. That is why flak, however lethal, became a tax rather than a wall. Why interceptions, however skillful, became an exchange rate Germany could no longer afford. Why the fight moved from the visible to the invisible. Fuel, training hours, maintenance cycles, the ability to keep aircraft serviceable and pilots alive in a contest of endurance. Once those inputs were degraded, courage and orders could not substitute for what the defense required to function. In the end, German defenses did not fail because men stopped firing or fighters stopped rising. They failed because the attacker redefined what pressure meant. Not occasional danger, but continuous exposure. Not a battle you could reset after, but a condition you lived under. And when air power becomes a condition, when it hangs over factories, rail lines, airfields, and ordinary streets like weather, the state beneath it begins to crack. Not from one blow, but from the certainty that the next one is already on its way.